Hannah sat in the shadows of her own home, where silence seemed heavier than words, and where her womb's emptiness echoed louder than her laughter. Year after year she hoped, and year after year her arms remained vacant, longing for a child she could cradle against her chest. Every morning brought the same reminder, as Peninnah's children ran through the courtyard with their endless energy and laughter. Their tiny feet made the earth tremble, while Hannah's heart trembled under the weight of absence. Before we embark on this captivating journey, we would love your support. Hit that like button. Subscribe to our channel. Share this video with others, and turn on notifications to stay updated on our latest stories. Peninnah, Elkanah's second wife, had what Hannah desired most, and she wielded it like a weapon. Her words dripped with mockery, cruelly reminding Hannah of her barrenness, as if stabbing her wound was her daily sport. The sting of those taunts was sharp, yet Hannah bore them quietly, tears slipping where words would not. Each insult replayed in her mind, long after the courtyard emptied, and Peninnah's laughter faded into the night. Elkanah, her husband, tried to console her with gifts and tender affection, yet his words could not fill the hollow inside. He asked if his love was not better than 10 sons, but how could she explain that her identity was tied to motherhood in Israel's culture? A barren woman was seen as cursed, as though heaven itself had closed its favor against her. The whispers of neighbors and the pitiful glances from relatives were chains around her spirit. Every year, during the pilgrimage to Shiloh, Hannah felt the wound reopen. Families filled the roads, children clinging to their mothers, laughter echoing like bells she could not reach. In the crowd, Hannah's face was always lowered, carrying both devotion to God and shame before people. She walked among mothers, yet carried the ache of one who was not. At the temple courts, sacrifices were offered and prayers rose like smoke, but Hannah's heart sank deeper. It wasn't just the absence of a child she mourned, it was the silence of God. She wept in corners no one noticed, covering her sobs with the noise of others rejoicing. Behind her trembling lips were prayers unspoken, for even voicing them felt dangerous to her hope. Peninnah's ridicule was relentless, especially during the feasts when Hannah should have been rejoicing. She turned sacred days into bitter reminders that Hannah's womb was closed. Hannah tried to eat, but her appetite often vanished beneath the weight of grief. The table full of food could not satisfy the hunger of her soul for the one thing missing. Each night she lay awake, listening to Peninnah whisper her triumphs in the darkness. The cry of another woman's child through the night became the cruel lullaby that mocked her. The years stretched long, and every season felt like proof that heaven's doors were locked against her. Her prayers seemed unanswered, and her tears felt unseen. Yet deep inside her pain, Hannah carried a quiet fire that Peninnah could not extinguish. She still went to Shiloh year after year, because somewhere in her brokenness she believed God had not forgotten. The loneliness of her heart became most visible in the crowd of worshipers. Surrounded by voices praising God for his blessings, Hannah wondered why her own life bore the mark of lack. Every child dedicated in the temple was like salt poured on her wound. She stood watching mothers place sons and daughters before God, while she had nothing to offer. The tension in her soul grew unbearable, pressing her to a breaking point that could no longer be hidden. She knew she could not live forever in the shadow of another woman's laughter. Why then would a woman who longed so desperately for a child one day choose to give him away? The answer hid itself in the depths of her agony, and in the vow she had not yet spoken. Her story was not just about barrenness, but about what God was preparing through her pain. The silence of her womb was not a curse, it was a stage set for divine intervention. Though she did not yet see it, her tears were watering the ground of a greater purpose. The emptiness that Peninnah mocked was the very canvas upon which God would write Israel's deliverance. In her silent tears lay the seeds of surrender, though surrender was the hardest thing a mother could imagine. Little did she know, her pain would birth more than a son, it would birth a prophet. Hannah's loneliness in the crowd was a foreshadowing of the offering she would one day make. What she longed to hold tightly, she would soon lay down freely. And so, while others saw only a barren woman tormented by her rival, heaven saw a vessel being prepared. The question that haunted her heart, why no child, was the same question that would later astonish all. Why give him away? Hannah's life was lived under the constant shadow of silence, not the gentle silence of peace, but the aching silence of an empty womb. In ancient Israel, where children were seen as a sign of divine favor, her barrenness spoke louder than any words she could utter. To be childless was not just a private pain. It was a public shame. The women of her village whispered as she passed, their eyes filled with pity that burned more than open mockery. To them, she was a living reminder of what it meant to be forgotten by heaven. Each murmur scraped at the edges of her dignity, telling her she was incomplete. In her culture, sons carried a family's name, daughters brought honor, and children as a whole secured a woman's place in society. Without them, Hannah's worth seemed to shrink before the eyes of neighbors and even relatives. She was treated as though her wom's silence meant God's disfavor. Every feast day at Shiloh was supposed to be a time of joy, yet for Hannah, it became a day of inward mourning. Families traveled together with children running ahead, their laughter echoing down the roads. Each giggle was like a bell tolling Hannah's emptiness. As offerings were brought before the Lord, mothers held their sons' hands tightly. Fathers lifted their daughters onto their shoulders with pride. Hannah stood among them with nothing but her prayers, her heart breaking in the midst of worship. Even at home, the sound of children never ceased to remind her of her loss. Peninnah's sons wrestled in the courtyard while her daughters sang songs their mother had taught them. Every shriek of play cut into Hannah's heart like a knife twisting deeper. Peninnah's presence sharpened her sorrow into unbearable torment. With a sly glance or a careless word, she made Hannah feel less than whole. The rivalry became a constant fire that Hannah had to walk through daily. Each time Elkanah divided the sacrificial meat, he gave Hannah a double portion, hoping to soothe her grief. Yet his kindness only magnified her pain, for no husband's affection could replace the cry of a child. Even his question, "Am I not better to you than 10 sons?" only deepened her loneliness. Hannah wrestled with more than human ridicule. She wrestled with heaven's silence. She wondered if her prayers stopped at the ceiling of her home, if her tears soaked the ground in vain. Was she cursed, or had God simply turned away? The spiral of unanswered prayer is a heavy one, and Hannah sank into it year after year. With every season that passed, she hoped for change, but every month ended with disappointment. Hope began to feel like a cruel trick. She longed not just for a child, but for a sign that she had not been abandoned by God. To her, a baby would be proof that heaven still listened. Without it, she lived with the gnawing fear that she was invisible to the very one she worshipped. At gatherings, mothers swapped stories of their children's milestones. They spoke of first steps, first words, and first offerings at the temple. Hannah sat quietly, her lips sealed, for she had no story to tell. The shame was not only external, but internal. She carried guilt as though her body had betrayed her calling as a woman of Israel. Each barren year was another layer of failure piled upon her soul. Yet beneath the weight of humiliation, a strange resilience was growing. Her spirit, though bruised, refused to break completely. It clung to the possibility that God had not written her final chapter yet. Though the world saw her as cursed, heaven saw her as chosen. The delay was not denial, but preparation. The crushing burden she carried was pressing her into the posture of surrender. The very absence that tormented her was forming space for a miracle far beyond her imagination. Her barrenness was not wasted. It was a furnace refining her faith. What seemed like rejection was shaping her for divine partnership. Her tears, though they fell unseen by others, were watering the soil of destiny. Every sigh, every sleepless night, every jealous glance at Peninnah's children was preparing her heart. Pain was chiseling her into a vessel that could hold a promise greater than herself. The shame of childlessness, while cruel in men's eyes, was sacred in God's eyes. It separated Hannah from ordinary expectations and lifted her into extraordinary purpose. Without realizing it, she was being set apart. At each feast, while mothers offered thanksgiving for their children, Hannah's sacrifice was different. She offered only her tears, her longing, her desperation. Yet those offerings rose as incense before God's throne. The loneliness that wrapped itself around her became the very place where heaven would meet her. Her ache created a vacuum only God Himself could fill. What she lacked would become the channel for His greatest gift to Israel. Still, in the moment, she could not see the beauty in the ashes. All she knew was the silence that mocked her and the shame that followed her like a shadow. Her days felt long and her nights longer still. The suspense lay in the fact that her suffering was not meaningless, though it felt unbearable. The weight of her empty womb was in fact the weight of Israel's destiny pressing on her shoulders. She carried more than personal pain, she carried prophetic promise. And so Hannah's story paused in tension, a woman crushed but not destroyed. What she saw as abandonment was in truth a divine delay, carefully orchestrated. The question hanging in the air was no longer, will she bear a child? But what will that child mean for the world? The evening shadows lengthened over Shiloh as families gathered near the tabernacle, their voices rising in songs of praise. Children played at their mothers' feet, while fathers prepared offerings. But Hannah sat apart, her heart heavy with unspoken sorrow. The air buzzed with joy, yet inside her was only silence and despair. Her eyes followed the families who laughed together as they carried their sacrifices. The weight of another year without a child pressed on her chest like a stone she could not lift. She felt invisible even in the crowd, as though her pain had no witness. The tabernacle lamps flickered against the dusk, casting holy light upon sacred ground. To others, Shiloh was a place of celebration, but to Hannah it became the stage of her last hope. Something in her spirit knew she could not leave this place unchanged. Her heart pounded as she slipped away from the noise of the feast. Alone, she fell to her knees before the Lord, her lips quivering as tears streamed down her face. Her body shook with the weight of years that had broken her spirit, but not her faith. She began to pour out words, not loud enough for others to hear, but strong enough for heaven to catch. Her lips moved silently, speaking prayers she dared not speak aloud. In her anguish, her soul spilled raw before the God she still believed could open her womb. For the first time, her prayer was not simply a request for relief, but a vow of surrender. Lord Almighty, if you will look on my misery and remember me, I will give the boy to you all the days of his life. It was a kind of prayer born only out of desperation and trust. Her tears blurred her sight, yet her vision of what she promised God was clear. She was not asking for a son to prove herself to Peninnah or to silence the whispers of the village. She was asking for a son to give him back as a living sacrifice. This vow transformed her agony into destiny, turning barrenness into a holy covenant. Hannah laid down her deepest desire on the altar of surrender. In doing so, she touched a place of faith few ever reach. But while heaven listened intently, earth misunderstood. Eli the priest, sitting nearby, watched her lips move without hearing sound. To him, her trembling frame looked more like drunkenness than devotion. He rebuked her sharply. "How long will you keep on getting drunk? Put away your wine." His words struck her like another wound on top of all she already carried. Misjudged even in her most vulnerable moment, she felt the sting of being unseen yet again. But Hannah did not lash back in anger. Through her tears, she spoke with trembling dignity. "Not so, my Lord. I am a woman, deeply troubled. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord." Her explanation revealed the depth of prayer Eli could not recognize. Her honesty disarmed him, and in that moment Eli shifted from critic to intercessor. He told her to go in peace and assured her that God would grant what she had asked. His words carried authority, planting a fragile seed of hope in her spirit. Hannah rose from the ground, her face still streaked with tears, yet glowing with peace. Something had changed, though her circumstances had not. Her prayer had crossed the threshold from desperation into destiny. That night, as the lamps flickered low, she carried home not a child, but a promise. The weight of despair lifted as she trusted God to remember her. What had begun as anguish ended in assurance. Hannah's vow marked the turning point, not only of her life but of Israel's future. She had offered God the very thing she desired most, creating space for divine purpose. Her surrender became the soil in which a prophet would one day grow. This was no ordinary prayer. It was a covenant that rippled through time. Her cry was not just for a son, but for a savior of a nation's soul. What she birthed in prayer would soon be birthed in flesh. Her night of desperate prayer revealed that true faith is not demanding, but releasing. She did not bargain with God to keep what she wanted, but entrusted Him with what He would give. It was trust at its purest, costly, and complete. Even as she walked away, her steps were steadier than before. She no longer carried the torment of unanswered questions. She carried the certainty that God had heard her at last. The misunderstanding of a priest could not overshadow the assurance of heaven. Eli's initial rebuke faded into nothing compared to the fire that now burned in her spirit. Hannah knew she had touched God in a way beyond explanation. In that holy exchange, the barren woman became a vessel of promise. Her tears were turned into the ink of a vow written into eternity. What Peninnah mocked would soon become what Israel celebrated. The tabernacle of Shiloh had witnessed many sacrifices, but none as powerful as Hannah's vow. It was not an animal laid on the altar, but a mother's longing placed in God's hands. Her prayer echoed louder than incense smoke rising to heaven. The turning point came not when her womb opened, but when her heart opened wider than her grief. God's answer began the moment her surrender was complete. Heaven had found in Hannah a willing partner, and so the night of desperate prayer ended not with finality, but with a beginning. The vow sealed in tears would soon be sealed in life. Destiny was already in motion, even before Samuel was conceived. The dawn of a new season broke over Hannah's life when the silence of heaven finally shattered. After years of emptiness, her body stirred with signs she had only dreamed of. The God who seemed far away suddenly remembered her. When she realized her womb had quickened, Hannah's breath caught in disbelief. Each day confirmed what had once felt impossible. Life was growing inside her. Her tears of sorrow became tears of awe. The months passed with quiet wonder, each kick within her reminding her that God had not abandoned her. She carried not just a child, but the weight of a miracle. Every movement felt like heaven whispering, "I see you." At last the cries of a newborn filled her home, a sound Hannah thought she would never hear. She held her son against her chest, his tiny heartbeat pulsing against hers. She named him Samuel, declaring, "Because I asked the Lord for him." Her joy was complete, and yet a shadow lingered. For deep in her heart, she remembered the vow spoken through desperate tears at Shiloh. The boy she cradled in her arms was never meant to remain fully hers. Every smile Samuel gave lit up her world, but it also reminded her of the coming cost. Each time she whispered lullabies, she heard the echo of her promise. The joy of holding him was mingled with the ache of letting him go. Elkanah rejoiced with her, his house now filled with the laughter of their child. Yet even he knew Hannah's heart was torn between motherly instinct and spiritual obedience. The dangerous vow hovered like a silent guest in their home. Hannah rocked Samuel to sleep with arms that clung tighter than she wanted to admit. She kissed his forehead, her lips trembling with both love and dread. How could she give away the miracle she had waited her whole life to receive? Her neighbors rejoiced, believing the story had ended with her barrenness broken. They celebrated her answered prayer, unaware that another test loomed before her. What they saw as victory was in fact only the beginning of her sacrifice. Samuel's laughter filled the rooms where sorrow once lingered. His presence shifted Hannah's identity from barren woman to blessed mother. Yet every day of joy carried her closer to the moment of surrender. The suspense of her vow tightened with each passing year. Would she keep her promise when the time came, or would she hold back the son she loved? This inner battle raged in the silence of her thoughts. Hannah remembered the night at Shiloh when her lips moved but no sound came. She remembered Eli's blessing, the tears that watered her vow, and the desperation that birthed it. That vow was not just words. It was a covenant sealed before heaven. Her soul knew she could not break it, even as her heart resisted. She feared the ache of empty arms after tasting the sweetness of motherhood. What mother willingly lays her child at the altar? Samuel's first steps brought cheers, but they also brought Hannah closer to farewell. Each milestone was a countdown to the day she would hand him over. The joy of his growth was shadowed by the dread of her obedience. At night, while Samuel slept peacefully, Hannah prayed for strength. She asked God to help her heart release what her hands longed to hold. She knew obedience would require more than love. It would demand surrender. The conflict grew heavier as Samuel's personality blossomed. His laughter, his voice, his innocent questions pierced her with delight and dread. Every bond she formed with him deepened the coming cost. Hannah could have silenced her vow, hoping God would understand her reluctance. She could have justified keeping Samuel by saying he was too precious to lose. Yet she feared disappointing the God who had remembered her. The weight of promise pressed harder than the weight of barrenness ever had. Barrenness left her empty, but obedience now asked her to let go of her fullness. This was the test no mother ever expects. And yet, hidden within her struggle was a greater truth. Samuel was never just for Hannah. He was for Israel. The child she longed for was destined to shape the destiny of a nation. Her vow, once whispered in anguish, had set Samuel apart before he was conceived. Hannah's private surrender carried public consequence. She was not raising just a son, she was raising a prophet. The irony of her story deepened its power. She had begged God for a child, and now the child would no longer be hers to keep. The very gift she longed for most would be her greatest offering. Though Hannah's heart ached at the thought, she began to accept the truth. God had remembered her not only for her sake, but for his plan. Her miracle was never meant to stay in her arms forever. And so the tension of her joy and grief wove together into a strange kind of peace. Samuel was hers to love, but God's to use. The question that lingered was not if she would surrender him, but when the moment would come. The days of Samuel's childhood were filled with laughter that warmed every corner of Hannah's heart. His tiny hands clutched her garments, and his voice rang through the halls like music. Yet every smile reminded her of the vow she had spoken years before in her night of desperation. As Samuel grew, the weight of her promise grew with him. With each milestone, his first words, his first steps, his first questions, Hannah's heart both rejoiced and trembled. For she knew she was not raising him for herself alone. The vow whispered in tears at Shiloh now stood before her as a living boy. Samuel was not just the answer to her prayers, but also the measure of her obedience. The cost of her promise pressed heavier with every year. Some nights she would hold Samuel close, inhaling the scent of his hair as if to memorize him. She wondered if God truly expected her to let him go after waiting so long. Could heaven really demand such a sacrifice from a mother's arms? The suspense of her heart's battle grew sharper when she watched other mothers. They held their children without fear of losing them, while Hannah counted down the days to release. Every embrace felt like both a gift and a goodbye. At times she considered silencing her vow, reasoning that God had already blessed her. Wasn't her devotion enough without surrendering Samuel entirely? Yet deep within, she knew promises made before God could not be undone. Her silent struggle became the story no one around her understood. Neighbors praised her blessing, yet they never saw the tears she shed at night. Even Elkanah, though supportive, could not fully grasp the ache of a mother preparing to give her child away. Every day brought moments of decision as she balanced love with obedience. Her hands longed to cling, but her spirit whispered that open hands honored God. Samuel's very existence tested her faith more than her barrenness ever had. When Samuel laughed, her heart swelled with gratitude and cracked with dread. Each giggle was a reminder that soon those sounds would echo in the tabernacle, not her home. The child who healed her barrenness would soon leave a new emptiness behind. Her prayers shifted from pleading for a child to pleading for courage. She asked God to make her heart strong enough to keep her vow. She begged for the strength to release what she most loved without regret. As Samuel matured, Hannah prepared him for the life awaiting him. She told him stories of God's faithfulness, guiding his young heart toward reverence. Without saying it outright, she was shaping him for a destiny apart from her arms. Each lesson she taught carried layers of hidden grief. She spoke of God's greatness, while knowing she would soon entrust Samuel entirely to that greatness. She whispered promises of God's care, even as she prepared to step aside. The inner journey from clinging to releasing was not swift. It tore at her, breaking and remaking her heart with every prayer. Yet surrender slowly replaced desperation, and peace began to grow where fear once ruled. Finally, the day came when Hannah could no longer delay her vow. Samuel was weaned and ready to serve at Shiloh. The hour of obedience had arrived like a storm she both dreaded and embraced. She dressed him carefully, her hands trembling as she tied his garments. Every gesture felt like sealing a farewell. Her eyes lingered on him longer than usual, as if drinking in his image for the last time. The journey to Shiloh was unlike any before. Families sang songs of thanksgiving, but Hannah's lips quivered with unspoken grief. She was walking not to petition God, but to lay her answered prayer at his feet. Samuel, unaware of the depth of the moment, skipped beside her with childlike joy. His innocence pierced her, for he did not know what awaited. She smiled through tears, determined to hide the storm raging within. At the tabernacle, Hannah's knees felt weak as she entered the sacred courts. Memories of her desperate prayer years earlier flooded her mind. This was the place where her vow was born, and now it demanded fulfillment. Standing before Eli, she held Samuel's small hand tightly. With trembling voice, she reminded the priest of her night of anguish when he had mistaken her sorrow for drunkenness. For this child I prayed, and the Lord granted me my petition. Therefore I give him to the Lord. The words cut through her like a blade, yet they also sealed her obedience. She was not surrendering out of loss, but offering out of devotion. Samuel was God's gift, and now he became God's servant. She released his hand, her fingers aching with the emptiness left behind. Her heart screamed to pull him back, but her spirit stood firm. The mother who once cried for a child now cried in surrender. As she stepped back, Samuel remained with Eli, and Hannah's arms hung empty once more. Yet this emptiness was different from her barrenness. It was filled with purpose rather than shame. The cost of her vow had become the seed of Israel's future. In that moment, Hannah realized obedience is the truest form of worship. She had given not just a child, but her very heart. And heaven received her offering with joy, for her sacrifice was shaping the destiny of a nation. The story of Hannah's pain did not end with the surrender of Samuel. In truth, it was only beginning. What looked like a personal tragedy unfolding in one woman's womb was in fact a divine drama shaping a nation. The crazy truth was that her barrenness had always been about more than her. Israel in those days was drowning in chaos, with no king to guide them, and every man doing what was right in his own eyes. The priesthood was corrupt, Eli's sons were abusing their sacred office, and the people were drifting far from God. The land groaned for leadership that was righteous and pure. Into that darkness came the boy Samuel, born from Hannah's tears and consecrated by her vow. He was not simply her son. He was God's answer to Israel's crisis. His life was a bridge between the corruption of Eli's house and the birth of a kingdom. As Samuel grew under Eli's guidance, the voice of the Lord began to whisper to him. The same God who had once been silent to Hannah now spoke clearly to her son. Israel was about to hear heaven's voice again through a boy who had been surrendered before he could choose his path. Hannah's obedience became Israel's lifeline. Without her vow, Samuel might never have been raised in the temple courts, positioned to hear God's call. Her sacrifice placed him exactly where destiny required him to be. One surrendered child began to carry the weight of a nation's future. Samuel became prophet, priest, and judge, the threefold mantle no one else in Israel carried. His presence restored the people's connection to the God they had forsaken. As he matured, Samuel confronted the sins that plagued Israel. He called them back to repentance, teaching them to turn from idols and trust the living God. The authority he carried was not born of tradition, but of divine calling. The boy who once lay on the temple floor, hearing God's voice, would one day thunder with prophetic fire. Kings trembled before him, and entire armies shifted course at his word. He was more than a miracle child. He was a nation's compass. The day came when Israel cried out for a king, longing to be like other nations. Though Samuel grieved, he obeyed the Lord and anointed Saul as Israel's first king. In that moment, Hannah's surrendered son placed a crown on the head of a nation. But Saul's heart soon turned from God, and the kingdom wavered in peril. Once again, Samuel stood at the center of history, carrying oil for another chosen vessel. In a hidden Bethlehem field, he anointed David, the shepherd boy, who would become Israel's greatest king. Without Hannah's vow, there might never have been a Samuel to anoint Saul or David. Without Samuel's obedience, the lineage leading to Christ could have been broken. One mother's surrender was the thread that wove together God's plan of redemption. It is staggering to think that Hannah's silent tears prepared the way for David's throne. Her private grief shaped public history, turning her pain into prophecy. The nation's survival rested on the shoulders of the boy she gave away. Every decree Samuel made, every battle he guided, every king he anointed, echoed back to that night in Shiloh. The vow of a barren woman rippled across generations. Her sacrifice became the foundation of Israel's destiny. The shocking truth is that what Hannah lost, the world gained. She gave her son to God, and God gave her son to a nation. In her surrender, Israel found its leader, its prophet, and its hope. Samuel's influence stretched far beyond his lifetime. He established schools of prophets, raising voices that would continue to call Israel back to God. He set a standard of integrity that contrasted with the corruption around him. When Samuel spoke, not a single word fell to the ground. This phrase became the testimony of his ministry, a legacy of divine authority rooted in Hannah's obedience. Her son carried a mantle that reshaped the spiritual climate of an entire people. Even in old age, Samuel guided Israel with unwavering faithfulness. His life was not about his own glory, but about fulfilling God's purposes. He lived as a living testimony that God can use the tears of one woman to water the destiny of many. The survival of Israel in those turbulent years was tied to the vow of a mother in anguish. Her personal story became a national rescue plan. The connection between her barrenness and the nation's future was no accident, but divine design. Hannah's pain had carved out space for a prophet who would restore the fear of the Lord. Her surrender had birthed the one who would prepare the way for kings. Through her sacrifice, God secured the future of his people. The boy she gave away became the man who gave Israel its voice back. He taught them to listen when God spoke and to walk in covenant faithfulness. Without him, Israel might have perished in confusion and corruption. This is the crazy truth. What looked like Hannah's deepest wound became Israel's greatest blessing. Her personal agony birthed national revival. Her vow was the hinge upon which the nation's survival turned. Hannah could not have known that her story reached far beyond her lifetime. She only knew that she had promised God her son and kept her word. Yet heaven knew, and heaven used it to shape history. So when we speak of Samuel the prophet, we must never forget Hannah the mother. Her silent tears, her desperate vow, and her surrendered heart became the seed of a kingdom. The survival of Israel was hidden in the womb of a barren woman who chose obedience over possession. Hannah had once walked through years of emptiness, clutching the silence of her womb like a secret wound. But the day she released Samuel into God's hands, everything changed. The child she surrendered was the key that unlocked the floodgates of heaven over her life. What looked like loss in the eyes of people became the very seed of multiplication in God's plan. After Samuel was weaned and dedicated to the service of the Lord, Hannah returned home to a house that suddenly seemed quieter and emptier than ever before. The echo of her son's laughter was gone, replaced with the memory of temple courts and whispered prayers. Yet even in that ache, she carried an unexplainable peace, as though her sacrifice had reached into eternity. God had not overlooked her tears or her trembling obedience, for in due time her womb stirred again with life. Hannah, the once barren woman who had known years of ridicule, felt the quickening of another child within her. It was heaven's answer. What you lay down for God never truly leaves your life. Her neighbors marveled, whispering about the strangeness of it all. Hannah had given away her only child, yet now her arms were filled again. The same lips that once mocked her now spoke blessings in awe. The woman once pitied now became a living testimony of God's abundance. She bore sons and daughters, each one proof that God's arithmetic is not subtraction but multiplication. Samuel was not lost to her. Instead, he stood as the first fruit of a divine exchange. For every tear shed in Shiloh, she now received laughter echoing through her home. Hannah's life revealed a principle deeper than human logic. Nothing placed in God's hands is wasted. The son she gave was not diminished by being offered. He was enlarged, amplified, made into a nation's prophet. And the children she received afterward carried the fragrance of divine reward. Still, the story was not merely about numbers, but about legacy. Samuel's name rose in Israel as a priest, a judge, a prophet who carried God's voice in turbulent times. Hannah's sacrifice had birthed not just children, but a destiny intertwined with her nation's survival. Each time Hannah rocked another child to sleep, she likely remembered the day she left Samuel at Shiloh. The ache was still there, but it no longer felt like a wound. It had become a scar turned into testimony. For every moment of loss, God had wrapped her in a greater story of purpose. The emotional truth cut deep. Surrender feels like loss, but it is truly gain in disguise. Hannah had discovered that giving to God was never the end of a story. It was always the beginning. Her legacy stretched far beyond her household, into the scrolls of Israel's history. When Samuel anointed kings, when his prayers shook the hearts of leaders, when his voice thundered as God's spokesman, Hannah's sacrifice was echoing in every word. She may not have stood in palaces or battlefields, but her obedience was there. The son she gave was her voice in places she could never go. Hannah's reward was not simply the gift of more children. It was the knowledge that her act of surrender had moved history. Her life showed that God's multiplication is both personal and national, intimate and cosmic. She had not lost Samuel. She had sown him into the soil of destiny. In the quiet of the night, she must have whispered prayers of gratitude, marveling at how her life had turned. Once she was defined by emptiness, now she was defined by overflow. Once her tears were mocked, now her joy was uncontainable. The lesson was undeniable. Surrender is the key to legacy. By letting go of the one thing she treasured most, Hannah gained what generations would remember. The woman who once felt forgotten by God became the mother of one of Israel's greatest leaders. Every feast in Shiloh must have felt different afterward. She would walk the same paths, but this time with children holding her hands and Samuel's name being honored among the people. The temple no longer carried the weight of her sorrow. It had become the monument of her victory. Hannah's wound remained open, a permanent sign that God had shifted her story. What had once been sealed was now flowing freely, as though God himself declared that surrender brings unstoppable blessing. She had traded barrenness for a legacy that could never be erased. This truth ripples into every heart that hears her story. What you give to God never disappears. It returns, pressed down, shaken together, and running over. Hannah's life became the evidence that no sacrifice is wasted when placed on the altar of faith. She didn't simply give up a child. She unlocked the destiny of a nation. Her willingness to release what she longed for most revealed the heart of true faith, and her reward proved that God cannot be outgiven. In the end, Hannah didn't lose a son, she gained a legacy. She became not only the mother of Samuel, but the mother of countless lessons in faith, trust, and surrender. Her name lives on, not as the barren woman, but as the one whose obedience rewrote history. Every child she bore afterward carried a piece of that miracle story, a reminder that her sacrifice had brought multiplication. Each giggle, each step, each milestone spoke of the goodness of God. Her home became a place of testimony rather than silence. The suspense of her earlier years now made sense. God had prepared her for a story bigger than she imagined. Without the pain of waiting, her surrender would not have carried such weight. Without the barrenness, her legacy would not have shined so brightly. Hannah's journey shows us the paradox of surrender. The tighter we hold, the emptier we become, but the more we release, the fuller our lives grow. She clung once and her arms were empty, but when she opened them to God, her arms overflowed. Her life was a living sermon that surrender brings reward. The final truth of staggering Hannah was remembered not for what she kept, but for what she gave. Her story thunders across generations. Faith is not proven by what we hold on to, but by what we release. And in that release, God writes legacies that last forever. The story of Hannah does not end with her tears or even her surrender at Shiloh. Hidden beneath her vow is a mystery so deep that it ripples across centuries into the heart of the gospel. What looked like the private pain of a barren woman was in truth a divine foreshadowing of God's ultimate gift to humanity. Hannah gave her only son because she trusted God's unseen purpose. It was a dangerous vow, one no ordinary mother would make unless compelled by heaven. And yet, through this vow, God whispered the outline of his own plan to give his son for the salvation of the world. Imagine the trembling of her heart as she left Samuel at the temple, never again to tuck him in at night. Her sacrifice burned like fire, yet it shone with eternal brilliance. She had released her miracle child, but heaven had already written his destiny. Centuries later, another woman stood before God with a similar surrender. Mary of Nazareth, young and pure, accepted a message that would change history. She would bear the Son of God. Just as Hannah handed Samuel over, Mary would watch Jesus walk into a destiny that would pierce her own soul. The parallel is too striking to ignore. Samuel became prophet, priest, and judge, shaping Israel's path and anointing kings. Jesus came as the ultimate prophet, priest, and king, not for Israel alone, but for the entire world. Hannah's vow was like a shadow cast on the wall, pointing forward to a greater light yet to come. Her act of surrender was not merely about one family or one nation. It was God rehearsing redemption in the pages of human history. The child she gave away became the doorway to understanding the Son God would one day give. This is the crazy truth that grips the heart. God sometimes reveals his eternal mysteries through the broken stories of ordinary people. Hannah's barrenness, her ridicule, her desperate vow, all were part of a divine script. Her pain was not wasted. It was a prophecy in disguise. Every time Samuel's voice thundered across Israel, it echoed with the weight of Hannah's sacrifice. And every miracle of Jesus, every parable, every act of love echoed with the weight of the Father's sacrifice. In both stories, surrender was the seed that birthed eternal impact. Hannah had longed for a child she could hold, yet God needed a man he could use. She prayed for relief, but God was preparing a redeemer for a nation. In Mary's case, she bore a son she would one day lose to a cross, and yet through that loss, the world gained eternal life. This is the hidden mystery. What you release into God's hands is never truly lost. Hannah did not lose Samuel. She gave him to God and gained a prophet for Israel. Mary did not lose Jesus. She released him to the world and gained a Savior for all. The tension is unbearable if you linger in the human side. Hannah's empty arms after leaving Samuel at the temple. Mary's tears at the foot of the cross as soldiers nailed her son to wood. Both moments scream of loss, yet in God's eyes both resound with victory. It is not coincidence that Hannah's song of praise in 1 Samuel 2 mirrors Mary's Magnificat in Luke 1. Both women sang not only about personal joy, but about God overturning the proud and lifting the humble. Their songs declare the same truth. When you give God what he asks, he shakes nations with it. What if Hannah had clung to Samuel? What if she had said, "God, I asked for a child, not for a loan"? Her story would have been smaller, her joy more fleeting, and Israel would have missed its prophet. Destiny often hangs on the thin thread of surrender. And what if Mary had refused? What if she had feared the shame of her pregnancy more than the call of heaven? The world would have remained in darkness. But because she said yes, light broke into the night. The mystery is not just historical, it is deeply personal. What God asked of Hannah and Mary, he may be asking of you in a different way. The surrender you resist may be the very key to the legacy you long for. It could be a dream, a relationship, a career, or a possession that you hold with clenched fists. Like Hannah, you may feel you cannot live without it. But the hidden truth is that what you release into God's hands multiplies far beyond your imagination. Hannah's womb was permanently opened after Samuel. Mary's obedience brought salvation to the world. What looks like loss in the natural always produces abundance in the spiritual when surrendered to God. This truth is both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it assures us that God wastes nothing. Terrifying because it demands a level of trust that feels like walking off a cliff without seeing the ground. But imagine standing in Hannah's sandals as she walked away from Shiloh, her son's small hand slipping from hers. Imagine standing in Mary's sandals as she watched the lifeless body of Jesus lowered from the cross. Both women must have asked, "God, was this worth it?" And heaven thundered back, "Yes, more than you could ever imagine." For Samuel would anoint kings, and Jesus would reign as King of Kings. The seed of surrender always grows into a harvest of destiny. The suspenseful note remains for us today. What if your greatest pain hides your greatest purpose? What if your barren season is not punishment, but preparation? What if the very thing God is asking you to surrender is the key to unlocking generations? The mystery behind Hannah's gift is not confined to the pages of Scripture. It is a living invitation for every believer. To give up what we value most is not to lose it, but to place it in the hands of a God who multiplies. Could it be that your Samuel is waiting to be released? Could it be that your surrender today will shape destinies tomorrow? The question lingers like holy fire in the soul. Will you trust God with what you love most? Because Hannah trusted, Israel gained a prophet. Because Mary obeyed, the world gained a Savior. And because you surrender, heaven may write a story that shakes eternity. If this moved you, please like, share, and subscribe. That's the only way you can help us. Keep telling the truth that saves.